In this video, we're going to take a look at some tactics and tools for supporting implementation of the Make Sense strategies, or really any other innovation you may be trying to do in your school. And so first we're going to take a look at some big ideas associated with supporting implementation, specifically as it applies to Make Sense Toolkit. And then there are a few very specific tactics and tools we're going to explore in a little more detail. So in terms of some of the big ideas, there's some really important tactics that leaders can do that will support the use of the Make Sense strategies. The first is to make sure that there are adequate resources, and particularly we're talking about technology. If teachers have PCs in their schools, the operating system needs to be at least Windows 7 or higher. Some of the older versions of Windows will work with the software, but sometimes there are glitches in it and that sort of thing, so really you need the up-to-date version of Windows. Likewise, if you're using Macs, the Macs need to be operating on OS X. It really doesn't matter whether it's Snow Leopard or Lion versions or even more updated versions than that, just so long as it's OS X. And there are two kinds of software that need to be loaded on the computers. First of all is Adobe Reader. Software won't work without Adobe Reader. And the other is Microsoft Word, not to be confused with Microsoft Works. It needs to be Word. Likewise, a really important thing for leaders to do is to work with the teachers that are implementing the strategies and work collaboratively to develop a long-range vision for increasing the use of the Make Sense strategies. And so this needs to be co-owned by both the leaders and the people doing the implementation. Another important thing leaders can do is frequently communicate to the teachers that are using it your value of how much they're doing that, because it takes a lot of effort and risk-taking, especially when they first start doing it. So the teachers that are using the Make Sense materials are really strongly encouraged, they're often recognized, and most importantly, they're reinforced for their efforts. Another important dimension of leadership is to create and protect blocks of time for teachers to work together to plan and dialogue specifically about using Make Sense strategies. So for example, often you'll have team meetings or departmental meetings and so forth, and those meetings often discuss a range of different topics. What's very important to do is to create a block of time within those meetings that is specifically devoted to talking about using the Make Sense strategies in terms of what their goals are, how well they're attaining those goals, sharing ideas about how it's been used, and that sort of thing. And the reason why I've underlined protect is because often those departmental meetings, there's often a number of different business kinds of items that have to be covered, and then they're often addressing important sort of crisis of the moment in terms of how are we going to deal with this student or that crisis and that sort of thing. And if we're not careful, the long-range planning and vision kinds of stuff gets sacrificed for the more immediacy of the moment kinds of items. And that can undermine your long-term efforts toward making innovation happen. So it's important to create and protect those blocks of time. Another thing that leaders can do is to frequently ask the teachers what they need to help them use Make Sense. Now, they may not need anything, but just asking is communicating an important message about how you value it and you're trying to support their use of it. Likewise, it's important to inquire about barriers to implementation they may be experiencing. Key to this whole thing is ongoing goal setting and planning and how to implement those goals. And so one of the tools that we're going to look at in a few minutes is something called the STEPS, Goal Setting and Action Planning Smart Sheet. And there's also a tool called the Fidelity Matrix that can be used for focusing on attention on just what is fidelity, what does it look like, and how well are we attaining fidelity. So part of this is, an important part is goal setting, but another part of it is actually assessing how well we're implementing. And so what we want to do is strive for a balance between fidelity and flexibility, because if we're too rigid in the implementation, then there'll be too many glitches and teachers will feel like it won't work for them. Likewise, if we're too flexible with the implementation, then the fidelity gets compromised. So we're sort of looking for a balance between the two. And one of the ways you can do that is through the assessments, is through the Make Sense walkthroughs, which we addressed in the previous video. But there's also a really powerful tool called the implementation survey. And this allows you to sort of take the pulse or the temperature of how teachers are feeling and thinking and how well they're valuing the use of the Make Sense strategies, what they see, their needs and things of that nature. So this is a pretty cool tool. So what we're going to look at first in a little more detail is this thing called STEPS. And so it's for goal setting and action planning. And so this is a tool that's actually one of the smart sheets that are in the software. I'll show you where to find that a little bit later. But it's designed for enhancing commitment to fidelity implementation. And so here's how it works. STEPS is a strategy. STEPS stands for select something to change or implement, and then tell it like it is now, and then envision the ideal. Then we're going to project how it can look in so much time, like X number of months, and it's going to be something that we feel is doable, and then we'll have a target date, and then finally scale up. How could it look in so many months if we were to attain this goal? So I'm going to kind of walk you through an example of how a middle school team would use STEPS. So select something to change or implement. And so in terms of Make Sense, what the team might do is target something about using Make Sense that's fairly specific. And so this is the 8th grade Dolphin team from Perdita Bay Middle School. And what the team came up with is what we want to do is do integrated use of the organizer, essential understanding, and vocabulary smart sheets across our classes. Tell it like it is now. So what we're asking teachers to do here is, without pulling punches, to really describe what they're already doing relative to this goal and tell it like it is. So this is sort of the baseline. So for an example, social studies and science, they use outlines for guided note-taking weekly, and they use webs occasionally, like once every 2 weeks. Language arts emphasizes webs for pre-writing, and the quality of webs are not assessed in any of the classes. Envision the ideal. So what we're going to do here is sort of pretend like they're waving a magic wand, and if they could suddenly bang, be there and be in a situation that looked the ideal, what would it look under the best of circumstances, without pulling any punches and without any barriers, just what would this look like if we were implementing it and we were there? That's what we note here. So it's sort of the long-term mega vision. And so, for an example, all our classes employ a range of organizer, essential understanding, and vocab smart sheets at least twice a week in activities and assignments. Then we're going to project how it can look in such amount of time and a target date. And so what we're doing here is not trying to reach the ideal, but what would be a step toward the ideal that in X amount of time, like a couple of months, that we see is doable, that we could do this, that moves us in the direction of the ideal, although we know it's not, what we're doing here is not actually getting there, it just is a step toward getting there. So for an example, in 2 months, that would be October 10th, each of us will be using the Frame graphic organizer, which is one of the devices in the Make Sense software. So each of us will be using a Frame graphic organizer for guided note-taking and or in-class reading activity at least once a week, and we share ideas and experiences using the frames during our weekly team meetings. Scale up, how could it look in X number of months? Basically the way this works is we have this ideal, which is almost pie in the sky ideal. This is a step towards moving us in the direction of the ideal, but we do see this as doable within 2 months. Scale up is okay, if we fast forward and we were able to attain this, what would the next step look like further down the road that moves us even closer to this, but we know it's still maybe not this, but it's even close, another step toward it. So in terms of scaling up, here's an example of what this team came from. All right, if we can do this in 2 months, here's what scaling up would look like maybe 6 months down the road. So each of us is implementing a range of organizer smart sheets, and we're coordinating activities and assignments to use in terms of the use of smart sheet and rubrics across the classes. So students learn to use the same smart sheet in a variety of ways, context, and subjects. And so basically, your STEPS goal setting is both goal setting and a bit of an action plan going on at the same time. Now notice this little thing over here that says cycle. Now the way this works is this is the first cycle, because what we're going to do is periodically revisit the STEPS goal setting and rethink things based on what we previously learned, and let those goals and plans evolve on an ongoing basis. So for an example, after a 2-month period or even sooner the team will then cycle back through and rethink things. So for an example, they may revise their vision based on what they learned during that initial cycle. So for example, that new vision often reflects a little bit less superficiality, a lot of greater understanding of some of the implementation nuances that are going on. It tends to reflect increased confidence. And so for an example, we still have the same goal in terms of select something to change, but this was the original tell it like it is now. Now we're too much down the road, and so now we need to tell it like it is at that point. And so for an example, here's what we're actually doing at this point in time. The social studies teachers are using the 3 main idea graphic organizer once a week for guided note-taking. In science, the frame graphic organizer or the cause and effect is used occasionally. Math, not using it all. In language arts, the frame and the plans, writing strategy is ongoing, but there's very limited use of other smart sheets and a very limited range of applications. Students like them. Okay, so that's telling it like it is now. This was our original vision of the ideal, but now that we've done this a while, our knowledge of what the ideal looks like has become a little more sophisticated and so forth. So we're gonna revise our vision of what the ideal is. So for an example, course of study standards are linked to specific smart sheets. We use a range of organizer, essential understanding, and vocab smart sheets at least twice a week in a range of scaffolded activities and assignments, especially y'all do it activities. Those are those high impact student engagement strategies. Smart sheet use is celebrated and reinforced. Students self-select the best smart sheets for a given task. In other words, instead of teachers assigning them a specific smart sheet to use, students figure out what they need and they go get it. Smart sheets are incorporated as assessment tools. We're conducting action research to assess smart sheet impact, and we're implementing with high levels of fidelity. Now remember, this is the ideal. This is the magic wand. If we could wave the magic wand and be at the ideal point, this is what it would look like. But that isn't necessarily what our goal is on a short-term basis. Now originally, the goal for projecting how it could look in terms of a step toward the ideal was basically using the frame for graphic organizer for guided note-taking and in-class reading activities twice a week, and then talking about it in the weekly meetings. Well, their knowledge and sophistication has become more sophisticated. Well, their knowledge and understanding has become more sophisticated since they've been doing this a little bit. And so now we might have a goal that reflects that different level of sophistication. So now the new target date, and this is 2 months again later, is now December the 20th. And so this is something we think we can do that we think is doable within the next 2 months. So all writing assignments in all classes require students to use the frame in the plan's writing strategy. So they're integrating it across the curriculum. We use the same rubric to assess writing. So the social studies teacher is using the writing rubric, as is the language arts teacher, as is the science teacher, and so forth. Each of us will continue using organizers, but also use at least one essential understanding or vocabulary smart sheet in class once a week. Student smart sheet work is posted on classroom walls and changed frequently. We share ideas and experiences using the smart sheets and brainstorm potential smart sheets for language arts, science, and social studies and math standards during our weekly team meetings. The implementation matrix is used to guide us, but we're not using it to collect data. I'll share this matrix with you in just a few minutes. So you can see now they're projecting how it can look 2 months hence, and this is a big step in this direction. Now, it's not that, but it takes them in that direction, and they do see this as something doable. So what's important that teachers list are things that are very specific in terms of what actions or what the goals are but they also view them as doable, but leads them in the direction of attaining the ideal. Likewise with the scale up, now that they've had experience using this, their vision of what scaling up looks like is going to change as well. So for an example, 6 months now from hence, each of us is implementing a range of organizer, essential understanding, and vocab smart sheets in multiple ways, like to pre-assess, to teach, to review. Science, social studies and science essay questions require students to use the frame graphic organizer or a simple matrix. Homework includes a smart sheet assignment at least once a week in each class. Grades include assessment of the ability to complete smart sheets. Weekly class time is allocated for meta dialogues or reflections. Those are the essential question type stuff about strategic learning with students. We're using the implementation matrix to assess fidelity. Once a month, each of us observe another teach a class using a smart sheet and discuss the observations afterwards. So you can see their scale up now looks a lot more sophisticated than the previous one did. And again, it's not this, but it's in a big step in that direction. So basically, the STEPS goal setting and action planning smart sheet is used as an ongoing goal setting and action planning tool. And it's frequently, or not frequently, but periodically recycled. And so at the beginning of each cycle, the previous STEPS goals are reviewed and revised. And so this reflects a continuous and realistic approach to facilitating meaningful change. It's always taking us in the positive direction. Where do you find something like that? Well, on the home page of the Make Sense Strategies Toolkit, there's a particular section down here called Smart Planners for Leaders. And under that is a link to what are called school-wide implementation strategies. So if you click on that, it will open up this page. Now there are actually 2 pages here. One are analysis of assets and inhibitors, and that's this stuff. We're going to skip that and click on Planning and Sustaining Fidelity Implementation. So if you click there, that opens this page, and the STEPS action planning is here. And so if you click on color, it will open up an interactive Word document that has that STEPS action planning on it. Now we're going to take a look at the fidelity matrix. And on that same page from the Make Sense, that's going to be this tool right here. And so this is basically a tool for enhancing commitment to fidelity implementation, and it's designed to help the teachers really understand what are the critical dimensions of fidelity, what are key things that we need to be thinking about to do this with fidelity. And this is meant to be a conversation tool to help them understand better the dimensions of fidelity, but it's not an accountability assessment tool. So for example, this is not something that we would go in and evaluate a teacher using and then rank the, evaluate the teacher using this. Now, the team does use the tool, and it is an informal type of assessment tool, but it's mostly designed for how are we doing and what do we need to do more of, as opposed to a tool for assessing individual teachers. It really should never be used for that. Okay, so the fidelity matrix addresses 4 really important dimensions of fidelity. Now, multiplicity deals with how many different tools are being used. Remember, we keep saying we need to use a range of this stuff. So multiplicity is how many different ones. The range is how many different places a tool is actually being applied in. Integrity is how well it's being used, like the instructional integrity. And diligence is how often the tool is being used. And so here's how this works. For an example, we're going to go back to that 8th grade Dolphin team. And so multiplicity are the specific innovative tools or tactics used. Now these can be tools like graphic organizers, or these can be specific instructional routines like Think, Pair, Share, or whatever different innovations we're targeting to get going in the school. So for an example, this 8th grade Dolphin team, one of the things that they're using is the main idea frame. The second one is range, And range deals with how many different curriculum areas or class preps is that specific tool being applied. So for example, the social studies teacher, Mr. Creek, is using it. The language arts teacher, Miss Wells, is using it. In science, Mr. Harbin is using it. Okay, and so we have this one tool being used in 3 different curriculum areas. Integrity is the quality of instruction provided when that tool or tactic is implemented. And so, for example, there can be a rubric on integrity. And so a score of 4, for an example, is highly effective, and what that looks like is students know what to do and how, and they're using them with few mistakes. That scaffolding assistance or gradual release is provided as needed and is appropriate. The smart sheet is developmentally appropriate for students. The information is essential to know. The purpose of the smart sheet of the activity is readily apparent to students. They understand why they're using it. And the smart sheet selected is an effective match with the nature of the information being taught. In other words, if it's hierarchical information, then the smart sheet reflects a hierarchical structure. If it's comparison information, then the smart sheet is a compare and contrast, and so forth. Likewise, students are in an active learning mode, at least most of the time. On the other hand, a score of 0 is really superficial implementation. So what that looks like are students seem confused about what to do or how, and they're making a lot of mistakes and need a lot of help. There's this absence of scaffolded assistance or the absence of the gradual release. The teacher's not doing the I do it, we do it, y'all do it kinds of stuff. Another problem is the smart sheet might be too sophisticated or advanced for the students that it's being used with, or it's too simplistic for students. They really needed something, a little more beefy. Another problem is the information that's being put on the smart sheet is not useful to know information. It might be interesting trivia, but not essential knowledge. Finally, the purpose of the smart sheet or the activity is not readily apparent to students. They're doing it because they have to do it, not because they really understand why they're doing it. And finally, the smart sheet doesn't match the nature of the information being taught. And, well, not finally, this is the final one. Students are in a passive learning mode most of the time, which is obviously deadly. And so when we go back to this main idea frame, just to recap, we're using that in 3 different places. And now we can look at how well each teacher is using this in terms of that range of integrity. And so, for example, if we take a look at the social studies teacher, this teacher scored a 2, whereas the language arts teacher, Miss Wells, scored a 4. So it looks like Miss Wells is using it with a lot more integrity than Mr. Creek is. And likewise, Mr. Harbin, only a 1. Okay, so now we've got multiplicity, range, and integrity. Diligence is how often is that tool used. And so 1 would be kind of a once and done. They only did it 1 time. Or 2 is about once a week. A 3 is like 2 to 3 times a week. And a 4 would be daily. So we can actually get a score for each of these teachers in terms of how diligent they are with using the main idea frame. And so, for example, Mr. Creek got a 3, which means he's using it 2 or 3 times a week, which is pretty good. Miss Wells, a 3, same thing. Mr. Harbin, he only used it once. That's a once and done. So that's not so good. So then what we can do is look at the other types of tools or routines that are innovative that are also being targeted and look at what's the range of that tool. So for example, the matrix with conclusions, that particular graphic organizer is used in social studies and science, but not language arts, so that wasn't listed. So the range there is 2. In terms of integrity, the social studies teacher is using that matrix in terms of a 2, whereas science, again, very poorly, only scored 1. Diligence, which means each of these teachers only used it 1 time, once and done. So the diligence on that's not very good. So that means if this particular graphic organizer is only used once, it's not going to have much of an impact on students in terms of really teaching them how do you think using one of these and draw conclusions. So the Crown Reflective Review is not so much a think sheet as it is an instructional procedure for ending a lesson. That's only being used in one place, social studies, but that teacher's smoking it. Mr. Creek really is doing a great job using the Crown Reflective Review procedure at the end of his lesson. Diligence is 2, which means he's doing it about once a week. And so you can see how this works. Now, this particular page contains 4 different innovations that are being targeted. If there's 6 innovations, you'll need another page to address the other 2, and so forth. But you'll get a sense of how that works. Then we can take this to the next level and start looking at this to look at, well, how are we doing in social studies? So for an example, the social studies teacher has been employing all 4 of these innovations. So the multiplicity looks pretty good. So in terms of the range or the integrity, it looks like this teacher needs to develop a little more skills, particularly in terms of using the main idea and the matrix. In terms of beginning and ending lessons down here, which is the Crown and the pre-assess, that actually looks a lot better. And so this teacher is frequently using the frames, and so teachers are likely to be, in terms of diligence, the teacher's using this fairly frequently, 2 or 3 times a week. And so because the teacher's using it so often, students are likely to become more skillful using it. In terms of the matrix and the pre-assessing, they only did that once or done, so that's not likely to have a whole lot of impact. Now let's look at the language arts teacher. Now the language arts teacher is doing an excellent job integrating the frame into writing instruction on a consistent basis, but is only implementing frames. In other words, none of those other innovations were listed for the language arts teacher. So this teacher's multiplicity is pretty narrow. She's only doing one thing, but she's doing that one thing really well and fairly frequently. The science teacher was attempting 2 innovations, main idea frame and the matrix with conclusions, but did both fairly poorly and did each of them only one time. So overall, when we look at this overall middle school team, how well is this team implementing overall? And so what we can do is we can take the total number of tools or routines implemented, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so we get a multiplicity score of 4. And then we can take the total number of curriculum areas, which are class preparations, total number of different ones, and that's a score of 3. Even though social studies is listed multiple times, we're looking at the number of different curriculum areas. So there were only 3 different curriculum areas that tool was being implemented in. And then we can look at the total number of integrity points for the team overall. So we can add all those points up and we get a score of 17. And then we can look at diligence in terms of how often the various tools are being used and get an overall score of 10. So we can add up those and get a score of 34 in terms of an overall implementation score. So then the question is does this score of 34 reflect high, medium, or low fidelity? Now remember, this is supposed to be mostly a conversation tool for supporting implementation, not an accountability tool. And so what we're doing with these tools is we'll use this at the beginning to discuss what does good implementation look like in terms of these 4 dimensions: multiplicity, range, integrity, and diligence. Another really good tool that you should take a look at is something called the implementation survey. And so this is a survey instrument, and you can, on that same page we were looking at before on the Make Sense, it's right here. And so basically what it is a 28-item survey. and it's designed to reveal teachers' perceptions of their value or investment in terms of how well they value these tools, in terms of increasing student outcomes. Do they think these are really valuable or a waste of time, that type of thing. It also reveals information in terms of how confident the teacher feels about using them and how competent they feel about using them. Likewise, it reveals information about how much time and energy and difficulty they perceive use of these tools to be, as well as what they perceive about the leadership and leadership expectations and how much support they're getting from leadership for using the various tools. It also assesses the degree to which teachers collaborate and support each other. So best practices in using the implementation survey. It's a good idea to administer it maybe 3 times a year. And so a good time is at the beginning of the year, and even though they haven't been implementing it that year, what it does is it sends an important message about leadership expectations and support. And it sort of sets the stage for setting goals and making plans, because it really unpacks a lot of critical things to be thinking about when you're doing implementing something innovative like that makes sense. Then you might do it again at the end of the first semester, and it sort of takes the temperature of how teachers are feeling about the various tools and so forth, and it reiterates the message of value. And it also provides important data for focusing support efforts in the second semester. And then again at the end of the second semester, the same kind of thing, but it also sets the stage for summer planning. So best practices also is it needs to be administered anonymously. You can also use tools on the internet like SurveyMonkey or other online services to administer the survey. So to review where we've been looking at various ways that leaders can support the Make Sense implementation. And back in part 1, we focused on, well, why bother? And so we discussed a little bit about the difference between casual and fidelity implementation, and the difference between saboteurs and runners and other types of personalities that you may have in your building, and how that affects professional development efforts. And we talked about some recommendations regarding a more strategic approach to implementing innovation. And basically, the notion is start with the teachers that are most likely to do it and really encourage and support them to get some roots down, and then use them as a basis for mentoring the rest of the faculty. And we also made the bold suggestion of not really putting a lot of effort into the people that are basically saboteurs or very strong resistors, because they're not likely to change anyway. And so we talked about focusing on those that will change rather than those that are not likely to. Now, you might not agree with that. That's just how I see it. Okay. In part 2, we looked at some of the critical features for planning and using the graphic organizers, and we looked at 3 critical dimensions. One was the quality of the graphic organizer itself, and especially the information that's noted on it. The quality of the graphic organizer instruction, how the tool is being used, and finally the importance of sustained applications. And so then we looked at some critical things to look for if you're going to do walkthroughs to support implementation. In part 3, we've been looking at some specific tools and tactics for supporting implementation. We started with discussing a number of really important big ideas about supporting implementation, and then we looked at some specific tools. For example, the steps for goal setting and action planning, which is a tool that's used recursively on an ongoing basis. We looked at the implementation fidelity matrix in terms of using that as a tool for helping teachers understand what are the critical dimensions of fidelity, and to give a sense of how well we know if we're doing fidelity well. And finally, we looked at the implementation survey, which is a really good tool to use 3 times a year to take the temperature of how teachers are perceiving the use of the Make Sense strategies and what they see are critical things, what they value about it, what they see their needs are, and so forth. So what follows now is the assessment, and this is going to focus on just sort of having you reflect back on these various things and targeting a few of these that you think will be particularly valuable to you.